Have you ever wondered about technologies and the influence that they had when they first came on market? Have you ever wondered whether the first innovators behind technologies were the ones that went on to dominate? Well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Ground Floor Innovation Channel, where we look at startups and how they influence the industry. I'm David, and today we're in Mountain View, California, outside of what was once Netscape. Now, for those of you that might remember back in the mid-90s during the browser wars, Netscape was kind of a big deal. There was a transition point around 1994 when Netscape first came on the market where we saw a sea change in how web browsers approached loading web pages. Today we take it for granted, of course, that everyone has high-speed internet, whether that's DSL or fiber connections, they're ubiquitous. But back in the 90s, if we go back in our time machine, we were accessing the internet on landlines. And that meant slow dial-up modems. The problem with that is if you have a web browser that's trying to load images and audio at the same time as text, oftentimes you'll be waiting for a big image to load and the website will appear broken. It won't even be accessible. Back in the 90s, very few people had access to high-speed internet, and that's true for both personal users and for businesses. And that meant there was a lot of bandwidth constraints. They were limited in terms of how much data they could load at any given time. And so while there were graphic user interface browsers before Netscape, meaning browsers that loaded both images and audio and copy, Netscape did something kind of clever.
Next time you're on the internet, go to the new Netscape.com.
They engineered a way for a web page to load so that you could read copy even as an image or video was loading in the background. That made the experience so much smoother, so much more seamless. As a result, when they launched in 1994, they dominated the market.
We have now pushed the source out on the net. Is that correct?
Actually, we decided not to.
In a short time after launch, literally a few months, they owned more than 90% of market share. They were off to the races. They really established themselves as the dominant web browser, which boded really well because it set them up for the ideal IPO conditions. And by IPO, I mean initial public offering. Now, those of you that were around during the original .com boom and then subsequent bust might remember that Netscape was kind of a big deal. They had an IPO in 1995 that blew expectations out of the water. And it really set the template for all of the other .com launches that were to follow. Up until Netscape IPO'd, it was very unusual for a tech startup to have an initial public offering, pre-profit, in many cases even pre-revenue, where the valuation wasn't tied to the money that was coming in. But Netscape turned that model on its head.
Initially offered at a price of $28 a share, Netscape shot up to $72 within minutes.
That became what's known as a Netscape moment. It paved the way for the entire .com boom that happened from 1995 and ultimately crashed in 2000. It was the notion that a company that hadn't yet become profitable, may not have even generated revenue, still had tremendous value because of the market share that it represented. So if you're Netscape and you've got lots of money and a technical head start, it seems like the game is over, you've won. Now this did an interesting thing. For one, it threw down the gauntlet for Microsoft. Microsoft realized that Netscape had in fact built the better mousetrap, and they needed to do something to address it. They assigned a huge budget, lots of R&D to fixing Internet Explorer. They realized that Netscape was a pay-to-play offering, meaning that while there were free versions of Netscape that could be used in educational contexts or for personal users, if you were a company relying on a web browser, you had to pay for that privilege. Microsoft saw that as an opening, and they were right to do so. They took their Internet Explorer platform and they invested heavily in R&D. They tweaked it, they refined it, they basically made it as good as they could make it, and then they did something brilliant, which was they gave it away for free. That's right, they bundled it with Windows. So everyone who had a Windows computer by default had Explorer, and there was no need to look at something like Netscape.
What about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
Now, if you're Netscape, that's a big deal. Because remember, Netscape's challenge was they were great technical innovators, but they hadn't yet proven out a revenue model. That didn't exist. What this meant for Netscape was bad news. It meant that Microsoft was able to recapture the market share. Now, Netscape ultimately in 1998, they did give away the product for free, but it really didn't sit with their business model, and it was too little too late. Ultimately, they were acquired by AOL. This was pre-dot-com crash, so the valuation, I believe at the time, was around $10 billion. So they exited just fine, but history tells the story. Microsoft continued to dominate with Explorer, and Netscape is now relegated to the history books. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, maybe leave a comment, let us know if you were around back when Netscape launched or if you were familiar with the backstory. We'll have many more features like this coming up in the future, and we'd love to have you along for the journey.